December 1944. Deep in the shattered forests of northern France, a German colonel hunched over his battered field desk, ink smudging across a hastily scribbled report. His eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights and relentless artillery fire, darted across the map. His handwriting trembled, not from fear but disbelief. He had seen armies before, maneuvering slowly, methodically, weighed down by ration trains and horse-drawn wagons. But this was something entirely different. American fuel convoys, long serpentine chains of trucks, blazed across the countryside at a speed that defied every law of logic the Wehrmacht held sacred. Hundreds of miles in a day, millions of gallons of precious gasoline delivered to the front lines day after day, as if the very rivers of France had been transformed into liquid fire. The colonel's report read almost like fiction. Impossible. Unnatural. A nation, once mocked for its soft soldiers, now moves with the efficiency of a machine. The Ardennes, with its dense forests and narrow roads, had always been a nightmare for logistics. Snow clung to branches like icy sentinels, roads turned to mud with the first thaw, and German patrols had learned to exploit every bottleneck, every choke point. Yet the Americans danced around every trap. Convoys moved in precision columns, escorted by jeeps and armored cars, radioed to perfection, constantly resupplied with spare tires, fuel and rations before a single wheel faltered. Each truck, gleaming under the grey winter sky, became a lifeline, a pulse in the circulatory system of an unstoppable army. By mid-December 1944, the Germans could no longer deny the scale. Entire panzer divisions were immobilized not by bullets or bombs, but by lack of fuel. The colonel's staff watched helplessly as American armor struck with terrifying regularity, the rumble of tanks echoing across frozen valleys. Behind each mechanical thunderclap, a meticulously calculated ballet of fuel trucks had danced through France, their drivers braving enemy fire, mines, and treacherous weather. How had a nation, still recovering from the memory of Pearl Harbor and years of rationing at home, built such a machine? The colonel scribbled furiously, trying to comprehend the impossible. Supply depots stretched like spiderwebs behind every frontline unit. Every soldier, from infantryman to tanker, seemed to operate on a system too perfect, too swift to be human. The Germans called it the Red Ball Express, an unending convoy of men and machines, a logistical lightning bolt that delivered 12,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food daily. Trucks with stretched chassis, reinforced engines, and fearless drivers kept moving, even as artillery shells tore the earth around them. Winter winds howled through the Ardennes, carrying the smell of smoke, diesel, and fear. The colonel felt the weight of history pressing down. Each passing hour, he realized, widened the gulf between the slow, deliberate pace of the Wehrmacht and the relentless American surge. Orders were ignored, roads clogged, supply lines collapsed under their own inefficiency. The enemy's advance wasn't just tactical, it was logistical genius, executed at a tempo that made entire regiments feel obsolete before they even reached the line of battle. And yet, amid the despair, a question gnawed at him. How did they keep it going? What secret machinery, what unseen orchestration fueled this relentless advance? Fuel, tires, engines, men, all moving like clockwork, a perfect symphony of speed and precision. It was a war fought as much in warehouses, fuel depots and truck cabs as it was on snow-strewn battlefields. The colonel's pen hovered above the paper. He paused, heart pounding. In all his years of service, he had never witnessed such a feat. Not from Rommel, not from Guderian, not from any of the generals he had revered in childhood. The Americans had transformed logistics into an instrument of war, and the world would soon see that battles could be won long before the first shell was fired. But what secret machinery fueled this relentless advance? Across the Atlantic, the United States seemed far removed from the chaos-consuming Europe. Its cities buzzed with industry, its factories hummed with peacetime production, and its military was still a relic of an earlier age. On the surface, it was a nation at peace, yet beneath that calm, a storm of preparation was quietly taking shape. The U.S. Army's motor pool was modest, almost quaint by modern standards. In 1940, the Army possessed roughly 80,000 vehicles, trucks, jeeps and half-tracks, scattered unevenly across training grounds and depots. Compared to Germany's fully mechanized divisions, bristling with tanks, armored cars and mobile artillery, America's force appeared painfully slow, limited, almost laughable. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg had already demonstrated the power of speed and coordination. To outsiders, the U.S. military seemed ill-prepared to match such efficiency, yet within the labyrinth of warehouses and depots, a quiet revolution was underway. The Quartermaster Corps, long dismissed as bureaucrats more concerned with paperwork than battlefield impact, began to sketch an audacious vision: total war logistics. They saw the war not merely as a series of battles, but as a relentless chain of supply, movement, and coordination, an unbroken cycle that could amplify America's industrial might into combat power. Visionaries emerged from the ranks, men who understood that speed could be as lethal as firepower. They studied engines, tire composition, fuel distribution, and convoy formations. Each detail was analyzed, tested, and refined. Trucks were modified to carry heavier loads, engines reinforced to withstand continuous travel, and drivers trained to operate in shifting weather and hostile territory. Plans for depots, fuel pipelines, and maintenance hubs were drawn with the precision of an architect designing a cathedral, except the cathedral's purpose was war itself. At first, these innovations were invisible to the casual observer. Soldiers trudged through training grounds, mechanics tinkered under the hoods of aging vehicles, and officers debated theoretical convoy schedules. But every calculation, every blueprint, sowed the seeds of an efficiency that would astonish the world. The Americans were preparing for a war they had not yet entered. Yet in their foresight lay the kernel of the unstoppable Red Ball Express that would later electrify the European front. The contrast could not have been starker. Across the Atlantic, Germany's divisions moved like clockwork, fueled by doctrine, experience, and an obsession with mechanized warfare. America, by comparison, seemed almost primitive, a patchwork of horses, outdated trucks, and a military culture steeped in tradition rather than innovation. Military analysts in Berlin dismissed the U.S. logistical network as weak, assuming that any protracted conflict would expose fatal gaps in supply and mobility. But under the surface, the gears were turning. The Quartermaster Corps envisioned a system where trucks could move continuously, depots could feed entire armies, and fuel, once a scarce and precious resource, could flow in volumes previously unimaginable. Men experimented with convoy speeds, route optimization, and maintenance protocols. They mapped European roads, imagined the challenges of winter snow and spring mud, and planned contingencies for every imaginable disruption. By the time American forces crossed the Atlantic, these seemingly minor innovations would converge into a force multiplier of staggering magnitude. In 1941, the United States was still a country testing the limits of its own machinery. Its army was slow, under-equipped, and underestimated by the Axis powers. Yet in the minds of a few, the vision of a nation capable of sustained, high-speed supply movements began to take shape, a vision that would one day crush German divisions immobilized by fuel shortages. And then, a distant attack, thousands of miles away, in the waters of the Pacific, would shatter isolation and ignite a revolution, propelling America into the war and forcing every careful plan, every patched-up truck, and every logistical insight into the crucible of total conflict. Yet, a distant attack would shatter isolation and ignite a revolution. December 7th, 1941. The dawn over Pearl Harbor was shattered by the roar of bombers, a roar that would reverberate across the globe. For the United States, the attack was both a catastrophe and a catalyst, a jolt that transformed a nation of planners and engineers into a nation at war. Suddenly, America's armies could no longer linger in theory or preparation. They had to move, fight, and supply themselves across oceans and continents they barely understood. In Europe, the scramble began almost immediately. Allied forces, preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history, faced a monumental logistical problem: how to fuel hundreds of thousands of men and machines thousands of miles from home. The D-Day beaches demanded an unprecedented daily ration of resources. Tanks and trucks guzzled fuel in vast quantities, artillery required constant ammunition, and soldiers needed food and medical supplies to sustain relentless operations. By early June 1944, planners estimated the requirement at over 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, enough to drown even the most meticulous supply chain in panic. Into this breach stepped the Red Ball Express, an audacious experiment in speed, endurance, and sheer human grit. A fleet of trucks, some fresh from factories, others hastily modified, was dispatched to carry the lifeblood of the advancing armies: gasoline, ammunition, and food. Drivers, many of them young African-American soldiers confronting both war and prejudice, took the wheel under conditions that defied imagination. Snow, mud, enemy fire, and exhaustion were constants. Each night they rested just enough to roll again at dawn, engines growling like mechanical beasts hungry for the next mile. One driver, Private James "Jimmy" Thornton, recalled the first convoy. "We left at so 300, headlights cutting through fog thicker than any wall. Roads were churned to mud by artillery, and some stretches had no pavement at all. We were told to keep moving no matter what. If we stopped, the men on the front would run dry. Every mile felt like a battle, every hill like a cliff. And the Germans, they thought we'd fail." German colonels sipping brandy in command posts initially watched with disdain. Their intelligence predicted chaos, broken vehicles, snarled traffic, and the inevitable collapse of a system that had been cobbled together in haste. But day after day, the Red Ball Express delivered. Convoys stretched hundreds of miles, moving like iron rivers through war-torn France. Fuel pumps ran non-stop, tires were replaced mid-journey, and drivers became legends for their stamina and courage. Within weeks, millions of gallons of fuel coursed through the veins of Allied armies, keeping Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and trucks moving relentlessly toward Germany. The contrast between expectation and reality was stark. While German officers had anticipated logistical failure, the Americans had turned desperation into innovation. Routes were optimized in real time, convoys organized in two-way patterns to avoid bottlenecks, and maintenance crews followed like ghosts, repairing broken engines and keeping the lifeline intact. Every setback, ice, mud, artillery fire, was absorbed, adapted to, and overcome. The Red Ball Express became more than a supply line. It became a symbol of endurance, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of victory. Yet the system was fragile. Tires wore down at alarming rates, drivers faced exhaustion that bordered on collapse, and a single miscalculation could snarl hundreds of trucks in minutes. Each convoy was a gamble, a test of coordination, stamina, and faith in machinery. The stakes were clear: failure here would halt the Allied advance, turn momentum to the enemy, and leave thousands of soldiers stranded without fuel, food, or hope. The engines roared through the night, miles slipping beneath endless wheels. Drivers like Thornton would become the unsung heroes of the war, their stories buried beneath the roar of tanks and the flash of artillery. Yet every mile carried a question, whispered along the roads. Could this fledgling system keep pace with the Allied invasion? Could this fledgling system keep pace with the Allied invasion? August 1944. The streets of liberated Paris still bore the scars of occupation, yet behind the celebrations, a new battle was quietly beginning. The Allies had pushed inland after D-Day, but the farther they advanced, the more the spectre of supply shortages loomed. Tanks stalled on muddy roads, artillery units idled without shells, and soldiers scoured depots for fuel. The front lines were moving faster than the supply could follow, a paradox that could stall victory before it was won. Into this precarious balance, the Red Ball Express roared to life. A fleet of 6,000 trucks, a mechanical army in itself, was unleashed with a single, urgent mission: deliver fuel and ammunition at unprecedented speed. Every vehicle, from the smallest jeep to the heaviest fuel tanker, became a vital artery in a vast circulatory system designed to sustain the heart of the advancing army. Every route was planned with surgical precision. One-way, priority lanes stretching from supply depots deep in France to the relentless push of armored divisions on the front. The numbers were staggering. By September, the Express was delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Convoys moved in an unbroken chain, drivers following strict schedules, each mile calculated to perfection. Roads that had once been the domain of pedestrians and horse carts now vibrated under the thunder of relentless engines. Bridges creaked but held. Narrow passes teetered on the edge of collapse but never broke. The American army had turned the chaos of war into a highway of triumph, where logistics itself became a weapon as formidable as artillery or tanks. German commanders, who had expected to cripple the Allies with sabotage and roadblocks, were shocked. Mines were cleared faster than they could be planted. Artillery shells rained down, yet the convoys moved like ghosts, weaving around danger with uncanny timing. The Nazis had assumed that America's hastily trained drivers, many of them barely out of basic training, would falter under the relentless pressure. Instead, they pushed forward night and day, driven by discipline, urgency, and sheer survival instinct. Each delivery was a silent triumph, a minor miracle that kept the war engine running while the enemy watched in disbelief. The Express was more than a supply line. It was a school of resilience. Drivers learned to navigate broken roads, flooded rivers, and enemy ambushes. Mechanics improvised repairs in fields with nothing but wrenches and spare parts. Dispatchers recalculated routes in real time, balancing fuel loads, convoy spacing, and the unpredictable chaos of war. Even the youngest soldier quickly understood that failure was not an option. Every lost gallon of fuel, every delayed crate of shells, could mean stalled tanks, overrun positions, and lives lost, yet the gamble was immense. Thousands of trucks, stretched thin and driven to exhaustion, teetered on the brink of collapse. One wrong turn, one mechanical failure, or one ambush could snarl an entire route. Every night, officers pored over maps, calculating risks, anticipating German movements, and praying that their convoys would remain uninterrupted. Despite the relentless pace, the Red Ball Express maintained its tempo, delivering not just supplies, but hope, a heartbeat that allowed the Allies to maintain the momentum of the invasion. As September wore on, the Express proved itself to be more than a temporary solution. It had become a lifeline, a mechanical river surging through the heart of France, sustaining an army that refused to pause, that refused to lose. Its success forced a grudging respect even from German officers, who began to realize that the war was no longer just a test of tanks and troops, but a test of ingenuity, endurance, and the sheer audacity to move faster than the enemy could react. But even as engines thundered and tires spun across battered roads, one question remained, whispered through command posts and roadside rest points. Would this high-speed gamble outrun the German counterattacks? Would this high-speed gamble outrun the German counterattacks? Night fell over the French countryside like a shroud, yet the highways never slept. For the men and women of the Red Ball Express, darkness was not rest. It was another battlefield. Convoys stretched endlessly under blackout conditions, headlights dimmed to slits, engines rumbling through fog and shadow. Every mile was a test of nerve, skill, and courage. The human story of the Express is one of endurance against impossible odds. Approximately 80% of the drivers were black soldiers, often facing prejudice both at home and abroad, yet their resolve never wavered. They drove vehicles that were older, heavier and more fragile than the German tanks they supported, and yet, mile after mile, they pressed on. Among them were women in auxiliary roles and immigrants, many fleeing persecution, who found themselves on the front lines of a logistical war that would decide the fate of Europe. Private Clarence Jenkins, a young driver from Georgia, remembered one night that would haunt him forever. The Luftwaffe came down from the sky like shadows with wings. You could hear the bullets ricochet off the metal, see the tracers streaking past. I had one hand on the wheel, one hand on the radio, and all I could think was, keep moving. If we stop, they stop our tanks. We cannot stop. Every word echoed the tension that defined the Red Ball Express. Drivers like Jenkins became legends in their own right, though their names would rarely appear in newspapers or history books. Mechanical failures were constant companions. Engines overheated, tires shredded on shell-cratered roads, and transmissions failed under the strain of relentless travel. Mechanics, following the convoys like shadows, patched engines and replaced tires in the field, often under fire. Yet the convoys continued, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, maintaining a pace that made even seasoned officers gape in disbelief. Blackout regulations meant that each convoy drove in near-total darkness, relying on memorized routes, subtle signals, and an almost preternatural sense of coordination. One wrong turn, and a truck could tumble into a shell crater, or worse, veer into the path of a pursuing German patrol. The diversity of the drivers added a hidden layer of strength. Individuals from every corner of America, speaking different languages and bringing different experiences, coalesced into a singular force. Their determination transformed the act of driving into a mission of survival, a defiance against both the enemy and the prejudice they carried with them from home. Each delivery of fuel or ammunition was a small triumph over chaos, a proof that human endurance could match and even surpass the might of machines. Amid the night, the convoy columns became a blur, trucks sliding past ditches, splashing through mud, engines groaning under the weight of their precious cargo. The men and women of the Red Ball Express operated in a liminal space between life and death, ally and enemy lines. Enemy fire could erupt without warning, mines waited beneath the road, and yet each driver carried on, a silent heartbeat sustaining the tempo of war. Every successful mile came at a cost. Exhaustion blurred judgment, cold numbed fingers, and sleep was a luxury for which there was no time. Letters home described the monotony punctuated by terror, yet drivers returned to the wheel again and again. They had become more than soldiers. They were the invisible hand moving the war forward. Their courage measured not by the number of battles fought, but by the miles endured and the tons delivered. As dawn broke, the road seemed endless again, stretching into fog and forest, yet no driver slowed. Each mile was a lifeline for the men at the front, for tanks grinding forward, for artillery spitting fire. Yet the line between ally and enemy blurred with every turn, every shadow, every unmarked bend in the road. And in that ambiguity, disaster waited, silent and patient, ready to strike at the heart of the unstoppable convoy. As convoys blurred the line between Ally and enemy lines, disaster loomed. September 1944. The forests of northern France were alive with the distant rumble of tanks. Yet it was the hum of engines on the highways that was changing the course of history. The Red Ball Express, an endless ribbon of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, and hope, had become the invisible hand behind one of the most audacious campaigns of the war. General George S. Patton, known for his lightning maneuvers and relentless drive, relied on this lifeline as he pushed his Third Army across France. Convoys rolled day and night, ensuring that gasoline reached tanks, trucks, and half-tracks at a pace previously unimagined. Within weeks, Patton's forces covered more than 400 miles, smashing through German defenses that had been carefully calculated to slow any advance. The speed of the American logistical system became its own weapon, leaving Nazi commanders scrambling in disbelief. Intercepted reports from German intelligence captured the frustration that permeated their ranks. "Impossible," wrote one colonel. "No army can sustain such momentum. The roads are clogged, vehicles scattered, and yet they move as if guided by some mechanical will." Entire divisions that had been poised to counterattack found themselves immobilized, fuel-starved, their tanks and trucks abandoned to the mud and the cold. The Red Ball Express had transformed supply into strategy, turning gasoline into a weapon more lethal than artillery shells. Patton's staff watched the convoys with awe. Each mile delivered not just fuel, but a psychological edge. Tanks arrived before German defenses could be reorganized. Infantry units advanced with confidence, knowing that every barrel of fuel, every crate of ammunition had been brought within reach by men who drove tirelessly, often in darkness, often under fire. The tempo of war had shifted. The Americans dictated the pace, and the Wehrmacht struggled to keep up. The human cost of this mechanized miracle was immense. Drivers were pushed to their limits, often sleeping only hours at a time. Tires shredded on broken roads, engines overheated under constant strain, yet the flow never ceased. Every truck that arrived at the front was a testament to endurance, coordination, and ingenuity. Convoys became a blur of motion, a living, breathing organism that consumed roads and produced speed, momentum, and inevitability. For the German colonels watching the reports come in, the realization was grim and immediate. Their calculations, honed through years of training and battlefield experience, had failed to predict the raw efficiency of American logistics. Commanders who had once believed their armies invincible now faced a relentless tide, their formations collapsing under a force they could neither stop nor outmaneuver. Fuel, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, flowed to the enemy with terrifying predictability. The very resource they had relied upon to slow the Allies had become a weapon against them. Patton himself understood the significance. In a rare moment of reflection, he confided to his aides, "This is not just tanks or bullets. It is fuel, oil, that carries war forward. Without it, even the finest divisions are powerless. With it, we can move faster than the mind can follow." The phrase echoed through headquarters as planners and soldiers alike grasped the magnitude of the achievement. A convoy, a line of trucks, had become the decisive factor in a campaign, breaking the Wehrmacht's ability to respond effectively, yet even in the triumph, a shadow loomed. The surge of fuel that propelled Patton's army was also fragile. Routes were vulnerable, engines strained, and drivers exhausted. One miscalculation, one blocked road, could halt the advance in its tracks, leaving forward units exposed and vulnerable. The brilliance of the Red Ball Express was matched only by the hidden risks that accompanied such unprecedented speed and scale, but this surge of fuel was a double-edged sword. What hidden crisis threatened to halt it? Winter came early in the Ardennes. Snow blanketed the dense forest, muffling sound and swallowing light. For the American GI, December 1944 was a world of frozen breath and frost-bitten fingers. But for the German colonels who planned Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, it was a moment of desperate hope. Their plan was simple: punch through the thin American lines, race to Antwerp, split the Allies in two. The only obstacle wasn't enemy tanks. It was fuel. German panzer commanders counted every drop. Their columns of Tigers and Panthers rolled forward like steel beasts, but each mile devoured the gasoline they did not have. Behind them, fuel trucks were scarce, sabotaged by Allied bombers, and their stockpiles dwindled faster than expected. Some German officers joked grimly that they were driving toward Allied fuel dumps, not to capture territory, but to siphon gas. The Americans, too, faced a nightmare. The blizzard turned the Ardennes roads into icy death traps. Luftwaffe fighters prowled the skies whenever the clouds broke, strafing convoys. And yet, the Red Ball Express refused to stop. Convoys of trucks, straining engines, bald tires slipping on snow, hauled life itself to the front. Every day, 500,000 gallons of gasoline surged forward. packed in jerry cans, drums, and tanker trucks. It was a logistical miracle in the middle of a storm. Drivers worked 20-hour shifts, their hands numb on the wheel, their eyes burning from fatigue. You kept driving, one remembered, because if you stopped, the front stopped. Patton, never one for understatement, put it plainly. My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas. And thanks to the convoys, they did. American armor, refueled on the move, counterattacked with stunning speed. Shermans, jeeps, and half-tracks poured through the Ardennes like a river of steel, trapping German forces in pockets that closed tighter by the day. For the Wehrmacht, the truth was humiliating. Panzers, symbols of German military pride, were abandoned in the snow, not because they were destroyed, but because they were thirsty. Whole battalions became useless hulks, their engines silent, their crews trudging on foot through the frost. Allied intelligence intercepted reports of German officers raging at their fate. We had the weapons, we had the men, but we had no fuel. The contrast could not have been starker. German convoys were hunted into extinction, while American supply lines multiplied. Each Red Bull truck that crept through the snow carried not just gasoline, but momentum that broke Hitler's last gamble. By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive lay in ruins. The German colonels who once laughed at American logistics now stared at maps filled with empty fuel depots, shattered columns, and an enemy advancing faster than they thought possible. The Red Ball Express, born in desperation months earlier, had outpaced their imagination and broken their strategy. But even in victory, there was a shadow. The speed of the supply convoys had come at a punishing cost. Wrecked trucks left frozen in ditches, drivers lost to ambushes and exhaustion. Men who had kept the lifeline alive but would never see home again. The Allies had won the race for fuel. Yet the question lingered in the frozen air of Europe. What was the true cost of victory's speed? The Red Ball Express was not only a lifeline of steel and gasoline. It was also a living artery, pulsing with human endurance. For every gleaming figure of tonnage delivered and miles covered, there was a hidden ledger, paid in blood, sweat, and exhaustion. The numbers tell part of the story. On average, 200 trucks were lost every week. Some slid off rain-slick curves. Others were wrecked in collisions during blackout runs. A few fell victim to mines or German ambushes. Many simply wore down, engines fried and axles cracked from the unrelenting pace. But behind each broken vehicle was a driver, a young man with a story cut short or altered forever. Most of those drivers were black soldiers, 80% of the Red Ball's manpower. Drafted into segregated units, denied combat roles, and often looked down upon by the very army they served, they found themselves thrust into one of the war's most dangerous and essential jobs. Day and night they proved that without their labor, the tanks of Patton and Bradley would have stood silent. One soldier recalled bitterly, "They wouldn't let us fight with rifles, but they let us fight the road." Fatigue was the deadliest enemy of all. Drivers logged 20-hour shifts, their eyelids leaden, their reflexes dulled. More than one convoy ended in a tangle of steel and screams when a weary driver nodded off for just a moment too long. Yet the system demanded motion. Stop! And the entire front slowed. Pause, and lives at the front risked being lost. The burden was more than physical. In the shadow of the Ardennes, a young driver named Private James Washington pressed his foot to the accelerator as snow blinded the windshield. His convoy carried gasoline desperately needed by Patton's tanks. Halfway through the route, Luftwaffe fighters strafed the road, bullets tearing through canvas and fuel cans. Washington swerved his truck off the road to draw fire away from the line of vehicles behind him. His sacrifice allowed the convoy to keep moving. By dawn, the fuel reached the front. Washington never made it out of the wreckage. Stories like his circulated quietly among the ranks, never making headlines, yet carried as a moral weight by those who survived. These men were not remembered for medals or parades, but for keeping the machine alive when every mile was a risk. And then there were the smaller indignities, the segregated mess halls, the unequal pay, the constant reminder that their worth was measured in gallons hauled, not in the honor they deserved. Even so, many spoke later with pride. They had proven something that could never again be denied. Logistics was war, and they had fought it with courage. The women who served, clerks, mechanics, and dispatchers, carried their own silent burdens. They charted routes, managed chaos, and kept convoys moving while their brothers, fathers, and husbands risked their lives on the road. Immigrant drivers, many barely speaking English, found themselves bound to the same relentless rhythm, their own sense of belonging tied to the rumble of engines and the screech of worn tires. All of them bore the same unshakable truth. The miracle of supply came at a cost, measured not only in steel and gasoline, but in human lives. As the convoys rolled on, the German colonels, who once dismissed American logistics as clumsy and uncoordinated, began to grasp the enormity of what they faced. The Red Ball Express was not simply a stream of trucks. It was the embodiment of America's industrial power, sustained by the grit of ordinary men. The freight they carried was not just fuel or ammunition. It was their own sweat, their own fear, their own humanity, delivered mile after mile into the heart of war. But the question remained, beyond the blood and sacrifice, what lasting mark did this logistical miracle leave on the battlefield and on the future of warfare itself? But how did this logistical miracle reshape the battlefield forever? By the chill of November 1944, the Red Ball Express had roared for just under 3 relentless months. Its convoys had torn across the arteries of France, an unbroken chain of engines and wheels, pouring fuel and ammunition into the advancing Allied front. And then, as suddenly as it had risen, the Red Bull was shut down. The headlines of the day said little about it. To the newspapers, the big stories were the liberation of France and the tightening noose around the Reich. Yet within the Allied ranks, every officer and driver knew, without those convoys, there would have been no lightning advance, no shattered German lines, no momentum carried to the Rhine. The scale was staggering. In its brief existence, the Red Ball Express hauled more than 400 million gallons of fuel, along with hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, rations, and spare parts. At its peak, the system carried nearly 12,500 tons daily, an industrial river in motion, guided not by canals or railroads, but by diesel engines, compass bearings, and human will. What began as a desperate improvisation in August became a model of efficiency. One-way priority routes slashed travel times. Mechanics kept battered trucks alive far past their intended limits. Dispatchers learned to move resources with precision, rivaling the very clockwork of German planning. In those few months, America had reinvented its military backbone. The shutdown did not mean failure. Quite the opposite. By late autumn, permanent pipelines and repaired railways had begun to shoulder the burden. The Red Ball had bought time. Time for bridges to be rebuilt, for rail hubs to be reconnected, for permanent infrastructure to rise where only mud and rubble had stood weeks before. The trucks had carried the front line across France. Now, the steel rails and pipelines would carry it into Germany. To German colonels watching from the other side of the Rhine, the sudden slackening of convoys was baffling. Some assumed American logistics had finally collapsed under its own weight. Others believed sabotage or winter had broken the system. In truth, the Allies had simply shifted gears, building on the momentum the Red Ball had created. For the men who drove, the end of the express brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief. The nightmare of fatigue, accidents, and endless road miles was finally over. Others felt pride. They had done the impossible, and had done it at a speed no enemy had thought feasible. Decades later, one veteran, his voice frail but steady, recalled, "They told us we weren't fit to fight. But when the army needed wheels, it was our hands on the wheel. We kept Patton moving. We kept the war alive. And we knew it." His words carried the quiet dignity of thousands who had served, forgotten by many, remembered by few, but forever bound to the greatest logistical gamble of the Second World War. The legacy of the Red Ball Express did not fade with the war's end. Its principles, Priority routes, rolling supply lines, centralized dispatch echoed into modern military logistics. From Korea to Vietnam, from the deserts of the Gulf to the convoys of today, its lessons have shaped how armies move, how nations supply, how wars are sustained. The Red Ball Express proved that victory is not only decided by the clash of armor or the roar of artillery. Sometimes it is decided by the endless growl of engines, by the persistence of tired drivers, by the gallons of fuel that keep divisions alive. It was not glamorous. It was not celebrated, but it was victory's lifeline. Could the lessons of these roaring convoys still drive us forward? History often remembers the thunder of cannons, the clash of armies, the banners raised above ruined cities. But in the shadows of glory lies another sound, steady, relentless, and far less celebrated. It is the low, constant growl of engines, the heartbeat of logistics, the quiet power that carries victory forward. The Red Ball Express may have ended in November 1944, but its echoes still rumble through our world today. Its lesson, that speed and coordination can triumph where brute force falters, resonates not just in battlefields, but in every corner of modern life. When disaster strikes in the 21st century, a hurricane, an earthquake, a flood, it is convoys and supply chains that spell the difference between despair and recovery. Relief trucks racing down broken highways mirror the urgency once felt on the roads of Normandy. Helicopters dropping food into devastated villages carry the same spirit of innovation under pressure. The DNA of the Red Ball Express can be traced in every emergency response, where human endurance meets the ticking clock. In technology, too, the lineage is unmistakable. The global supply webs that deliver microchips, medicines, and food are the grandchildren of those wartime convoys. Container ships and cargo planes follow the same principle. Goods must move fast, uninterrupted, with precision. Where once it was gallons of gasoline sustaining Patton's tanks, now it is servers humming in data centers, vaccines crossing continents, and aid reaching crisis zones. But beyond the machinery lies something more enduring: unity in diversity. The Red Ball Express was powered by soldiers who were underestimated, segregated, and often dismissed. Black drivers, immigrant laborers, and overlooked mechanics held the wheel of history in their hands. Together they defied prejudice and proved that greatness comes not from privilege, but from performance under fire. This is a truth as urgent now as it was in 1944. In a world fractured by challenges, from pandemics to climate change, the need for cooperation across divides has never been greater. The convoys remind us progress is not the triumph of a single individual, but the collective roar of many engines pulling in the same direction. One veteran, reflecting decades after the war, put it simply: we weren't heroes with rifles. We were drivers, but we drove history forward. His words, stripped of drama, carry the weight of reality. Heroism is not always found in the dramatic moment of charge or counterattack. Sometimes it is found in the persistence to keep moving, mile after mile, when the world cannot afford for you to stop. The Red Ball Express was more than a logistical miracle. It was a symbol of what happens when ingenuity meets urgency, when ordinary people unite to meet extraordinary demands. Its legacy is not confined to the past. It whispers through the engines of trucks delivering relief today, in the code of systems that track global shipments, in every unseen hand, ensuring the world's machinery does not falter. And so, the thunder of those convoys still echoes, not only in the annals of World War II, but in the very pulse of our modern world. They remind us that speed is not recklessness, but readiness, that diversity is not weakness, but strength, and that in unity and momentum, no obstacle endures forever. The Red Ball Express was built for war, but its lesson belongs to peace.